The SEC is currently losing in court every single day against the Bitcoin business. In this video, I'm going to talk about what's happened recently and tell you why I'm now fine with the SEC taking Ripple to the Supreme Court. I know what you guys are thinking, and you shouldn't wait. I don't want to keep going on, so I want to describe why the situation isn't that bad. Last but not least, I want to talk about Bitcoin spot ETFs at the end of someone who told me about this video earlier today. That the SEC would send any Bitcoin ETF ideas to the exchange, I'll tell you why that's not always true and why we might be heading in the right direction. This is important because it means that we will have a bull run unlike any other. With their ETFs, these huge institutions are getting into the Bitcoin market. Read on to find out why we are making some progress in this area. As I always say on this channel, I won't get into politics, but we do need to think about some of these controversial issues because they will have a big impact on the cryptocurrency market. So, if you haven't been living under a rock and have been paying attention to the news, you probably already know that. The Supreme Court has made two big controversial decisions in the past 2 days. The fact that the court is willing to rule against the federal government is a big deal for the Bitcoin industry. This is important for the Bitcoin industry because it's likely that some of the current Supreme Court cases will involve cryptocurrencies. It's good to know that our Supreme Court is willing to rule against the federal government. Also, that SEC has a bad track record. 5 of their last 6 cases at the Supreme Court were lost, so when we talk about Ripple going to the Supreme Court, this is important to remember in the back of our minds. We have a feeling that if Ripple went to the Supreme Court, it would only do so because Ripple forced it to. Why would Ripple want to go to the Supreme Court? You may be wondering if Ripple could just keep appealing until they got to the Supreme Court, and then bang if Judge Torres ruled against them in this case. From what I've seen so far, I think it's almost certain that the SEC will lose against Ripple. Another important thing to think about is what would make them go to the Supreme Court. I think that if Ripple wins and the SEC loses, there would be clarity in the market for XRP. There would be at least enough clarity for places like Coinbase to start relisting the asset until this case is appealed or until we get a new ruling. Until we hear otherwise, XRP would have won, at least until we hear otherwise. The SEC would be essentially playing with fire in the meantime. This could lead to a situation where they change the Howey test to be more specific to cryptocurrencies and give up all of their power. This is why I even bring up the possibility that this could be good for Ripple. Or the SEC is too scared to do so, in which case it must stop right away. It is important to understand that this situation is only happening now because the Supreme Court likes to fight against the federal government and hates the SEC, no matter what you think of their other choices. It's important to remember that the fight between the Bitcoin business and the federal government is at least going well. Shortly, the Supreme Court will hear a few more cases that concern the SEC. For those of you who don't know, the SEC has a very shady habit of prosecuting securities crimes in its courts. This is because if the SEC thought they were going to lose a case, they could find a way to bring it to an internal court and convince one of their judges to rule in their favor. This means that the SEC has a lot of courts that are already set in their favor, that they would bring cases to me. When I saw it for the first time, I couldn't believe it was real. However, as of right now, the Secretary's acts will be challenged, so it looks like the Supreme Court will decide soon. The SEC will also lose a lot of power if they lose this case, which I think they will. Based on how the Supreme Court is ruling, the SEC will have to think about its cases much more carefully, and they won't be able to say, okay, let's bring this case whether we're right or not, but since we have power over this court in the end. The SEC always loses cases in front of the Supreme Court, so I think that these kinds of things will stop. Stop them, but I hope this clears things up for you, no matter what you think about the current political situation. Maybe we are in a pretty good place, at least when it comes to coins. They said the Supreme Court would be such a rubber stamp for the SEC. I would take all of these issues to the Supreme Court if they went to court, but it looks like the Supreme Court will decide against the SEC. It puts a lot of limits on what the SEC can do in this situation and how much they can scare these companies. I want to talk about Bitcoin spot ETFs next because they caused a lot of fuss this morning. And if you keep an eye on the Bitcoin market, you probably noticed the sharp drop after the SEC said it would turn down any Bitcoin ETF that came its way. A reporter who claimed to speak for. But what the SEC wrote and said wasn't always true, and I find that interesting. Forbes said that the secretary's words on Bitcoin spot ETFs are more like a speed bump than a stop sign. So, what's going on here? The SEC didn't exactly say that they would just reject these ETFs that they came up with. Most of the time, the SEC would just reject the ETF and say okay. It's surprising to see the SEC give helpful feedback these days, though. We won't tell you what happened. Incorrect, but the SEC. They're saying, hey, you said you were going to pull data from exchanges, which is constructive criticism. We need to be aware of these interactions. I found this interesting because I've been hearing people like John Deaton talk about it recently, and he thinks it's a step in the right direction. What makes it an improvement? I think that's what we've been saying, though. From the start, the SEC has planned to give this type of asset to the established financial system. What steps did the SEC take? All of the early ETFs made by Bitcoin companies were turned down, but they now plan to work with the established financial player systems to get their ETFs approved. What are the pros and cons? News. Without question, the SEC knows how to pick winners. And since they're both winners and losers in this situation, they're going to give us and the rest of the world this ETF before they hand over the coin businesses. The good news is that, as I've said in previous films, this is something I never expected to happen. So, it's a big step forward for all coins in general. I thought that Gary Gensler and the SEC would do everything they could to stop cryptocurrency. They wouldn't let any goods be sold and wouldn't even let it look like they were willing to work with. These big players in the traditional financial system, like BlackRock Fidelities and other huge institutions, are supporting cryptocurrency goods. Even if these ETFs are turned down, I think it shows that we are much closer to general adoption than many people thought. Also, I think Gary Gensler and the SEC will have to accept this product because they are now in a lot of trouble with the party in power. Gary Gensler and the SEC have been very bad. Several Democrats have already spoken out against Gary Gensler's management of the Bitcoin market. The way things are in politics right now, no one ever leaves their party. All of them are moving at the same time. Explain why their regulator is taking these good steps and why the regulator of the other party is taking these bad steps. But the fact that Democrats are now turning against Gensler, their watchdog, shows, in my opinion, how far out of favor he is in politics. Because of this, Gary Gensler might be trying to give the SEC and himself a win in the crypto area, so they can say, see, I told you we were neutral when it came to technology. We just weren't going to give this product to an unregistered Bitcoin business that doesn't do X, I, and C to make some good products. We'd like to give it to BlackRock first. This would be a great way for Gary Gensler to avoid looking stupid. However, the question of whether or not Gary Gensler cares about his image or how people see him is very different, and I think it is fair to worry about that. Gary Gensler's time in politics might not be over, but I have a feeling he won't be back. I have a feeling that this man has other political goals and projects he wants to work on after the SEC. If this is true, he will want to make sure that at least the Democrats will support him by showing that he tried to do a good job. We know that Gary Gensler is taken care of. There are videos of Gary Gensler saying that more than 70% of the cryptocurrencies on the market are not securities. These videos are all over the internet, including this one, and just now he calls them securities. Gary Gensler will need to do something to show that he is not just calling for an unfunded attack on the Bitcoin sector. He will also need to show that he can think things through. In my opinion, approving these ETFs is a great way to do that, and let me just say that we will see a bull run, unlike anything we have ever seen if BlackRock puts billions of dollars into this. Anyway, thanks for being here, and I hope this update was interesting. If you did, please remember to like and subscribe.